Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, Nick. Yes, I can hear you.
I am.
Hi, Nick.
Once we've got everyone on, we'll lock it. Who's Frank Brown?
Frank from Church Frank, I would imagine.
But not part of the team right now.
Right. I don't think we have a waiting room set up. Is that right?
No, but what we can do is we can lock the room and then allow people in once we've just cleared everything up.
Okay. However, Nick, I was wondering if I could make you host.
Yeah, I'm going to log in as, now that you're in, I will log out and I'll log back in as myself. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, so I'll log out.
Okay.
I hope it doesn't log you out at the same time.
Hi, Anne.
Hello, Pamela. I'm sure glad you sent the your thingy from the church today because a friend called and said, I don't have the link. And I very conveniently just forwarded what you had. So I get to meet Juliet.
Hi, Anne. Nice to meet you.
Same here. Thank you for what you've done.
You too. Thanks for getting us here to this point.
Yeah.
Just linking, I think, because you and Nick started it back in, I don't know when you started it. Was it February or January?
Yeah, it's gone through a long journey to get here, but it was so wonderful. And I thank you for just carrying the torch. And I've been hearing wonderful things about your racial justice background and learning, and looking forward to future connections as well.
Same here, Juliet. Thank you.
This is a really important
part. A lot of pets in your house.
We've got lots of people. We've got a whole tent in the background. I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of ridiculous.
I want you to know, Juliet, because of you, I had to make a change on my trivia questions.
Oh. How is that?
I said, oh, I have a wrong answer. It started with Pamela being the answer, and then I had to correct it to Janet, and now I find you are the one.
What is
for what?
Who has the most pets of anybody at
Oh, that's funny.
Is it really the Buxton Beck family?
Oh my God. I do want, I think we are running like a little funny farm out here. So
don't tell anybody the answer, Pamela.
Okay.
It was hilarious.
Oh, that's funny.
I just came in from herding the chickens from underneath the rose bush and trying to get them inside the coop before the other dogs came to play, because my dog has a standing play date at 5 every night.
Poor chickens. Oh, there's Julie.
Your dog has a play date. We need to start doing that. Our dog needs to learn how to be around other dogs. She's not very socialized.
Hello, Julie.
Hi, Julie.
Hi, can you?
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
I'm really excited you're here finally.
Nice to meet you. Sorry, it's been a little hectic with the beginning of the quarter, and then everything, it's like every day it goes from something, to something else.
Yes, absolutely. I totally get, I'm feeling like I thought I would be so much more prepared for tonight and have some kind of lovely statement ready, and there's going to be a lot of winging it, but it'll be fine.
You're going to do great, Pamela.
Yeah. Julie, is it possible to like bring you closer into view? You seem small in your frame. Do you want to it's whatever you're comfortable with, but just wondering if you want to bring yourself closer into the frame so that it's not so much white space around you. Maybe that's pretty good, and a little more centered. You're still a little low in the frame, however it feels good to you, but that looks better. Thank you.
That's better.
Yeah.
I like you a little bit closer and a little bit higher, actually, Julie. You are the star of the show, and we want to be sure yeah, that helps. That helps a lot. Yeah.
Can we hear how you're doing so that we can also do a little sound check on how you're sounding from your end? How are you today?
I'm fine. I'm using a mic into the computer, so hopefully that'll be good.
It does sound good.
Knowing how busy the school year is and you agree to speak right at the beginning of the quarter was very generous of you. Thank you, Julie.
No problem. It's been, it was fun to plan and organize, and, Nick and I were about to do this event, in March when the pandemic happened.
You were so generous the very day, March 10th. And you said, I could still do it on the Zoom.
Yeah, it was still that, that place where we were like, it was very confusing about what was happening,
I remember well having those last minute phone calls, trying to figure it out. And I'm just so glad this worked out. When Nick comes back, we should probably do some of the tech stuff. I've made him a host, and he'll make all of you co-hosts, I imagine, so that, or at least whoever needs to be able to unmute themselves and things like that. So Carol will want to be a co-host, I think, because of that will give her some control over bouncing people if necessary. I will say on the diocesan Facebook page, they shared our event. And they did a great job also last week of talking it up at a weekly meeting with the bishop. But we've had some kind of icky responses too. So I'm just a little more prepared than usual. A couple of people who are climate change deniers, it looks like. So showing up on Facebook to give us grief.
Who are affiliated with your church or just in
Not
general?
with our parish. It's hard to know. I think one of them is definitely at a church up in Trinidad, and apparently I've found out has been a little bit of a thorn in the side of the diocese for a while. The other one I didn't recognize the name at all. And I also got a phone call today, I don't know if it's related, but from a guy who's really angry that we're not meeting in person, and who is demanding that I have an in-person meeting with him because COVID isn't real. So there's just some weird stuff going on. So
there's always outliers.
Yep. Essentially the same day that we made the decision to close down the church grounds and buildings due to the pandemic. And so we had to make some very quick last minute decisions, and that was really horrible to, at that point, just have to, we thought, cancel. We were hoping we would be able to find a time to come back together, but we really didn't have the capability at that moment to do something like this via Zoom, but now we do. And so as we began to adjust to this new normal, people in our Care for God's Creation team said, shouldn't we try again? And so I'm so grateful that Julie Z said yes to trying again. I think she even offered right in that moment she was going to try to do a Zoom conference with us, and we just weren't quite ready. So your flexibility and adaptability and generosity really means the world to all of us. I will be doing an introduction of our speakers in a moment, but Nick Buxton is going to take over for a minute to give some technical and housekeeping updates.
Well, welcome everyone. It's really great to see a good number of people joining us from all over. My name is Nick Buxton. I'm part of St. Martin's Church, also an environmental activist and climate activist for some time here in Davis and before that in the UK. I'm hoping most people will have used Zoom before. It's suddenly become a very major part of our lives in a very quick way. But for those who are a little bit more unfamiliar with it, if you're joining by a computer, you can basically scroll down to the bottom of the page and you'll see a few options there. One of the options that will be useful for you today will be the chat. If you're on a phone, you just have to touch the screen and the option will come up. And in the chat, you can both introduce yourself. You can also send messages to everyone or just to individual people. The chat's going to be important because that's where we're going to be asking people to pose their questions. We may not be able to get to all the questions, but that's the best way without kind of interrupting the speakers and so on, that we can start to pull together the different questions we might have in this conversation. And it's also where you can share your own thoughts on what you're hearing and what you're taking in from this event. So that will be the kind of main thing, the main way that we can kind of feed into the conversation today. I think the other thing to mention is that in the top right, you have an option to have both the speaker view and the gallery view. The gallery view means that you can see everyone there, but if you want to focus on the speaker when they're speaking, you might want to switch that to the speaker view. That's a good way of just kind of focusing on the people who are doing the speaking. I think that's it for now. Just do use the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on that and starting to feedback. If I remember anything else, I can always bring that into the conversation later. So anyway, welcome. I hope you find this a useful and stimulating conversation. It's been great to see you all here.
As Nick's backup, I'm going to remind, just let everyone know that we are recording, that this is going on Facebook Live. So if that's an issue, you can always stop the video and just be present through your screen. And it is recording though. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, Nick. And thank you both for the work you've done to make this night possible for us. I wanted to begin, again, this is Pamela Dolan, if you're still joining us, and I'm the rector here at St. Martin's, and I'm just delighted to welcome so many of you to this event tonight. We made a decision early on that we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement, and that is something we haven't done in our parish before. But I was looking it up, and it's been about 10 years since the Episcopal Church began working on exposing the doctrine of discovery and helping people to learn how to dismantle some of the harm that is still being done and has been done in the name of the church. And we have a whole page on our Episcopal Church website about our Indigenous ministries efforts, and a wonderful, actually, short film about the doctrine of discovery. So lots of information there. But one of the suggestions that's often made is to simply acknowledge whose land it is that we are standing on when we come together, even when we come together virtually like this. And so it's a small step, but I think it's an important step. And I'm really delighted that Adelita has offered to do that for us tonight. So take it away.
Umeteo Tlasokamati, giving thanks, and that's how I say thank you in my Indigenous language, Nahuatl. So I want to say thank you to all who are gathered here on this virtual platform. And as Pamela mentioned, we're going to start with the land acknowledgement. And so we're going to acknowledge the land in which we are all gathered, which for most of us here it is the land of the Patwin people here in Yolo County, which also is that of the Yocha Dehe Wintu Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to their stewardship of this land over many centuries before the arrival of colonization. So we want to honor their stewardship. They cherish and protect and have always protected the land, and elders continue to instruct the young through generations to do the same. And so if you are not on Patwin territory, we acknowledge the land in which you reside, wherever you're tuning in from. So giving thanks to the ancestors of this land and the ones that have been carrying on the tradition of taking care of this land, we give thanks. And I pass it back to you, Pamela.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful, and we are committed to doing this more often, to having it be something that's visible in our spaces, and you've made a beautiful start to that. So thank you. Well, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our two main speakers tonight. Most of you probably came here after seeing some form of the flyer that was produced for this event. And the name of our event is the same as the name of a book that we're going to be talking about, some Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. And the author, Julie Z, is here with us tonight. She is a professor of American Studies and founding director of the Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Davis. She has authored and edited 3 books and numerous articles on environmental justice and inequality, culture and environment, and urban and community health and activism. And just having a couple of chances the last week or so to speak with her a little bit. I know she's going to be a wonderful speaker tonight. This is a really, I am not done with the book, but I am reading it, and it is really important work. And I think we're all going to have a lot to learn from. Our other speaker is Adelita Serena, and I have a little bio here for Adelita. She is a climate action organizer in the Capital Region of California, who has lived in Woodland for nearly 2 decades. I'm a Woodland resident myself, yay, go Woodland. Grew up in Salinas as part of a farm working family. Following in the footsteps of her father, who worked with Cesar Chavez, Adelita started organizing when she was in high school, rallying her peers to put on street performances about local issues. The experience was so powerful that it led her to work with at-risk youth, as well as survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence for many years. Adelita is passionate about using her ability to communicate with underserved communities to improve their conditions by providing resources and services. As the mother of 2 teenage boys, she has become increasingly concerned about the climate change impacts they are already experiencing, from extreme heat to wildfires. She is passionate about developing and centering the leadership of women from marginalized communities to achieve energy democracy and preserve a livable climate. She has a Bachelor of Science in Digital Film and has held leadership positions in various agencies before joining Mothers Out Front in July of 2018. And I hope we'll be hearing more about Mothers Out Front when the way the format is going to go is we're going to spend about 20 minutes with Julie answering some questions that I will pose for her, and then Adelita will be able to come in and sort of do some response, and hopefully it will turn into a whole conversation. That's our hope for tonight, including some of the comments and the questions that you might be sharing in the chat box. So Julie, I don't know if you wanted to say anything to introduce yourself, or if you want to just jump in now and let me start asking these questions. I can't see you on my screen, so I want you to at least say something so that you pop up.
I wanted to share a couple of slides.
Great.
Before you started asking those questions. I think the slides will help. Can you see my slides or no?
Yes.
Okay.
I can see part of
Okay.
the slide. It's a little
Hold on.
low. Mhm.
Hold on. Wait. Okay, I have no idea what happened. Let me try again. Okay, share, and then I'll do this. Okay, so hopefully you can see the slide right now. And I want to just start by acknowledging today's the day that Breonna Taylor's, the police officers who killed Breonna Taylor were not charged with anything other than one of them was charged for potentially harming her neighbor. And so I think that, you know, we're in a moment of many crises and many dangers, but on the day when a decision like this happens, I think we have to acknowledge that that's kind of a space that some people are feeling and upset about. For those of you who don't know about Breonna Taylor, you should read about her. Some of the policing that went against her was related to policing against the drug war, which was is very racist in its application, and also the policing around gentrification in Louisville and Kentucky. There are so many others victims of police violence, and so I just really want to begin by saying that, you know, that we should say her name today in particular. I wanted to start briefly with some facts. It's been hard for me to write recently because there's so many things that are happening, and every day moves from, it feels like, crisis to crisis. From the wildfires to the impending political crisis that we are facing right now. The book that I wrote is called Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, and it came out in January, before COVID and before the incredible amount of energy and anger around the killing of George Floyd and many others from police violence. And then again, this impending political crisis of authoritarianism, which we need to face and be really clear about what is about to happen. And so even though the book was written and published before this moment of danger, I think we have to have a lot of clarity about how these current dangers are tied to the dangers that the book talks about. So some facts to consider. Some of these, I think most of us know some parts of these, but sometimes I just have to sit with them. The United States is the single greatest contributor to cumulative carbon emissions since 1750, so 25% of historical global emissions. The UK was the largest until 1882, and then the US took over. Less than 5% of the world's population is in the US, but 20% of the world's incarcerated people are in the US. And the racial disparities for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people are incredibly high. Related to that is we know the US has the highest rate of police killings, 4 times that higher of the next highest nation. Another example of disproportionality in terms of violence, the US, again, less than 5% of the world's population, yet owns 45% of the world's privately held firearms. The US has, as of June 2020, had 25% of the world's COVID death rates. Again, wildly racially disproportionate for Black, Latino, and Indigenous populations. So I think, you know, these are just a set of numbers and facts, but to me, these questions of disproportionality, racial disproportionality, and justice are what undergird what environmental justice as a movement is about, to address these extreme disproportionalities and these extreme questions of the concentration of power and how it's exercised to create violence and the suppression of life and the ability to breathe or live for many people, but particularly people of color, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people. So this book, Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, was written, and it's meant to be kind of an overview introduction book to the environmental justice movement, and to synthesize what many people know more about now than ever before. And I've been working on environmental justice since I was a student activist 25 years ago. And at that point, it was a different moment. It was before the internet. It was before social media. So a lot of the question then was kind of the need to prove empirically that there was racial disproportionality. I remember before GIS, those old transparencies, you know, people would put demographics and lead poisoning. And there was, again, this need to prove that there was such a thing called environmental racism or environmental inequality. We're at a very different moment in terms of the research, but also in terms of the understanding of what the problems are, the examples of environmental racism, the examples of environmental injustice. So this book is meant to be a crossover overview book about what environmental justice movements are and what they fight for. It comes out of my own experience beginning again as a student activist, and then all the many years I've worked with environmental justice movements in New York, in California, and with coalitions both nationally and internationally around environmental justice. So my scholarship comes out of an engagement with movements and with communities that have been fighting these issues for a very long time. The royalties for this book go to two organizations that I work with. One in Visalia, the Community Water Center, that does an incredible work around water justice and farm worker, water access, water poisoning, and so on. And Uprose, an environmental justice group that is based in New York, that does a lot of work around just transition. They're leaders in the climate justice movement. They were key organizers with the People's Climate March. So again, this book is meant to be a primer, an explainer book, and not a specialist book. And part of that is because environmental justice is always an action-oriented, change-oriented field, whether that's in activism or in the academy. So that's the kind of brief, like, summary of it. The question that I ask in the book is, what crossroads and moment of danger are we in right now? And what might we learn from environmental justice in our moment of danger? The book is focused a lot on a number of case studies. Many people know about what happened at Standing Rock. Many people know about Flint, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria. And so what I wanted to do, it's not like it was in the 90s where you had to explain what environmental racism and lead poisoning or asthma was, and you needed to document it. In some ways, people really do understand. But what I wanted to do was to create a timeline and a kind of readable overview of these different campaigns, but also connect it to the scholarship that happens within the academy and generated by social movements. So tying the events at all of these places like Standing Rock, but tied to themes of settler colonialism, extraction, gender violence. In the second chapter, I talk about water racism and water justice. And many of us were shocked and horrified by what happened to Flint, but a lot less people know about the everyday way in which water racism is baked into the industrial agricultural landscape in the Central Valley, specifically the Southern San Joaquin Valley. And so what ties the Flint and the Central Valley case are around these questions of privatization, neoliberalism, the idea that markets are the answer to the problem, and so on. And the last chapter talks about, again, these spectacular disasters, but also tries to claim a space for restorative environmental justice and this idea of having radical hope and drawing from Gramsci, a non-naive radical hope in a moment where hope is very hard to find. And so that was one of your questions, Pamela, so we can talk about what non-naive radical hope looks like and whether I have any. The argument for the book is simple. It's that environmental justice are freedom struggles. And by freedom struggles, I mean struggles for freedom, for life, for the ability to survive, but more than survive, to create and live in a context both historically and in the moment that invites death and violence against some people and not others. By thinking about freedom struggles, I am trying to connect the environmental justice movement with other justice movements, reproductive justice, for example, but also tying that idea to a broader tradition from the Black radical tradition and from indigenous activism and scholarship. The argument is that environmental justice movements are particularly significant now. They have always been insistently intersectional, even though that's not necessarily a word that environmental justice movements and activists use, but that is it's embedded in the idea that the environmental justice movement, when they said in the 90s that environmental justice is where we live, work, and play, the refusal to think of environment as separate from society, or that nature was not also about workers and cities. Environmental justice has always been blatantly, lovingly intersectional, insistently so, and also crosses time and space in terms of understanding the problems, but also what the solutions might look like. And it was interesting, just as an aside, in the third chapter, which is talking about climate, I use the work of activists, native activists in Kivalina, which is one of 400 Arctic indigenous villages in Alaska that are currently being washed away from sea level rise. Kivalina is not exceptional, except that they sued the oil and gas companies for the harm that their emissions did to their communities. And the activist, the Inupiaq activist Colleen Swan in Kivalina talks about the doctrine of discovery in her work. So again, that idea of thinking about justice and through this lens of time, as far as the doctrine of discovery in Colleen Swan's eyes. So I think, I just wanted to put those ideas out there, and then you had a series of questions that you wanted to ask me as well, but I wanted to have that as kind of the opening as well. So
that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that's especially helpful for people who have not yet had a chance to look at the book, to kind of give that framework and baseline information. I think we're still seeing your screen. I don't know if we can change that. There we go. We want to be able to see you. That's fantastic. I think you answered some of the questions already, but that's okay. We'll try to dig into them a little bit more. The first question was going to be about why you wrote the book, and I feel like at one level that's the overview that you just gave us about the moment that we're in and how important that moment, how critically important this moment is. But I'm wondering so many of us get involved at from some sort of personal impetus. Our job, our real life, quote unquote, is in some other field. For myself, I know I became quite agitated about the situation that we're in from two different perspectives. One was living in St. Louis when Michael Brown was murdered in the streets and seeing what the uprising in Ferguson meant and learning from that. And having children at the time who were very affected by it, and the whole community was affected by it. And at the same time, I was working on a doctoral thesis around gardening as a spiritual practice. And it took a long time to start to see how those actually maybe were connected. There was a tendency, I think this was not that long ago, 2014, 2015, but at least among lay people, I'll use that term in the broader sense, to not quite get the overlap, the intersectionality that you're talking about. So if you can just say a little bit more about what environmental justice in particular means to you. I don't know if it's worth going into how it's different than climate justice, or if you use those terms interchangeably, and just how that changes how those of us on the ground might address, but what we can do to address climate change. If we look at it from the environmental justice lens, than say environmentalism, for instance.
That's a really good question. I remember, I always tell this anecdote that when I was an organizer, there was this environmental justice and climate change coalition, and they produced a fact sheet that said what would happen if there was an extreme hurricane that hit New Orleans. And I remember looking at it, and this was in '97, and reading it and thinking, oh, that can't happen. There's no way a major city could be flooded, you know? And so I think what the point I like to make is that the justice activists, whether they're labor justice activists or environmental justice activists, the predictions that they made, you know, in the 90s, and the climate scientists who've been doing this work for a very long time, basically we have to take them at their word that this is true. And this will happen. And so I always like to tell that story because I like to share sometimes my own sense of like my own shift, you know, because if you're a certain age, you didn't grow up with knowing about climate change. You know, that's not something that we grew up with. Our children, I have 2 teenagers, it is a completely different reality for them, you know? And so to know that, you know, we can't have that kind of naivete or that kind of innocence of like, oh, well, I can't think about that because that's too overwhelming to deal with. Do you know what I mean? Because I remember thinking, you know, looking at that and saying, God, there's no way New Orleans is going to be flooded and thousands of people will die and, you know, this will happen. Well, it was actually, and this is, you know, if you follow or read literature, you know, Octavia Butler and the Black radical vision, that feminist sci-fi vision that she has espoused, a lot of people are reading her again. And, you know, she hit the New York Times bestseller list recently as basically predicting everything that's happening right now. So I think what we have to do is understand and refuse our own innocence, you know, our own like, you know, oh, well, something else will happen and fix us and rescue that. If we have that approach, especially now in the next, you know, 40 something days, we're in for a whole like set of pain, you know? So I think I'm a believer in what authoritarians say they're going to do. I'm a believer in what oil and gas companies, like where they put their money and how they hide information. And, you know, and this is not just oil and gas, it's also cigarette companies and so on. I believe them. And then I believe the activists and the scientists for saying why that stuff shouldn't happen. And so what we need to do is to understand what the stakes are and the urgency, you know, instead of dithering around with our own, you know, naivete about what's at stake here. And, you know, the book makes an argument about how these gasps of and the extreme violence that we're seeing right now is around the protection of structures of whiteness, structures of carbon, and structures of capitalism. And it's that big of a question. And, you know, I always right now, you know, go to the Gramsci quote about, you know, the old world is dying, the new world has yet to begin. Now is the time for monsters. So we're kind of in this moment of monsters. But I forget what your question was.
That's okay. Me too.
What my point was is like, if you see, like when you were in St. Louis and you were doing your work and you saw the urgency, you know, you could either put your head in the ground, you know, and say, I don't understand it, or you can look at it squarely and understand what's at stake, you know, and do some of the learning and then, you know, do the work. And so I think that's the main lesson also of the environmental justice movement, is that the optimism I have is that the movements do the work and they fight incredible battles. And their importance is not about whether they win most of their battles. And in fact, most of the time they don't, but it's the fight itself that's important.
That's a fantastic segue to talking about Standing Rock. I think that was an area, again, for me, sort of like the Michael Brown, Ferguson uprising. Standing Rock, the publicity that came up around that woke a lot of people up and got people thinking. I think people who had white people like me who had maybe never really considered what was the current plight of Indigenous peoples in our country, not just thinking of it as something that happened at Thanksgiving, quote unquote. And many of us were activated to go out and to do something. I went to Washington, D.C. and was part of a big march to the White House. And and then what? You know, then it felt like, well, we failed. I would imagine being a climate activist for a long time, you're used to that feeling of the immediate outcome that you're looking for didn't happen, you know? So can you talk a little bit about Standing Rock? It's really prominent in your book, and where do we go with that? I'm sorry, I'm also looking at some chat ideas. Yeah. So, but anyway, can you, and then maybe we can bring Adelita in sooner rather than later, because I imagine she wants to jump in on some of this too. But if you could address the Standing Rock example, just as an example.
Yeah, I mean, the book is not original research by and large, except for the central parts of the Central Valley part are based on research that I did. And so what I did in the Standing Rock chapter, I mean, this is the good part of the moment we're in, is that there is a lot of sort of day-to-day, you know, things that happen. Do you know what I mean? Information is shared. And in some sense, this is the kind of the upside, but I mean, it's a double-edged sword, which is more people know about Standing Rock. Like you can just say Standing Rock or Flint, and you know, people kind of know. But on the other hand, people kind of don't know a lot of the details. Do you know what I mean? And so that's why I wanted to write the book, in part because I needed to learn myself. And so there was so much information, and there's so much scholarship and so much activism. And there's a Standing Rock syllabus that is like over 1,000 pages long. And so that's the upside of kind of the social media, internet ubiquity of these things. And so, you know, if you're interested in learning more about like the specificity of, you know, the killings in Charleston, there's a Charleston syllabus, there is a Standing Rock syllabus, there's a Flint syllabus, there's a Hurricane Maria syllabus. And so I understood that most people are not going to sit and read 1,000 pages on Standing Rock with links to another, like, you know, 1,000 pages of what the historical information and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So what I try to do is just synthesize, you know, the basic chronology. And, you know, I think a lot of this question and how it's tied to climate is really important, because in some ways, you know, there was a lot, you asked me about environmental justice and climate justice and what's at stake in framing. For me, there is no real difference between environmental justice and climate justice. The principles of environmental justice shaped the principles of climate justice, and a lot of the leaders of the climate justice movement are environmental justice movements. You know, I don't think that there's a difference. I do think there is a difference between mainstream climate approaches and climate justice approaches. And the groups like Climate Justice Alliance and groups that are focused with a justice or lens are very different from technocratic mainstream approaches to climate, which, you know, I think are also, it's important to think of climate as a technological and a policy related problem. And, you know, again, I'm oversimplifying that. But on the Standing Rock case, it's really important that the people at Standing Rock, the native and their non-native allies, said this is not an environmental movement. It's about water protectors. This is indigenous sovereignty. You know, so I think you really have to understand what happens, and also strategically sometimes said, yes, this is also a climate justice movement, so that these things can be not connected and hyper connected at the same time. And so I think sometimes for some people's minds, there's just like, I want a line, you know, and I want this to be here and this to be here. And I think that justice movements are not like, they don't think like that. So, and I think that's a good thing. So.
Can you just speak a little bit to the sense that people who are new to this work might have had, that like, well, we tried and it didn't work. There was a sense of failure, and how do you keep going when that happens?
Well, Natalia put in the chat that, you know, Standing Rock was one of many, and that's absolutely true. So it's just, there are so many cases that are happening, and, you know, I'm not a sociologist that, you know, tries to explain why one thing gets attention and not others. You know, that's not the question that's interesting to me. The question that's interesting to me, and the lesson that I learned, is from the activists themselves. And so people who have been fighting these struggles for a very long time. And so, you know, Tom Goldtooth at the, you know, who's head of Indigenous Environmental Network, and Dallas Goldtooth, his son, you know, were at Standing Rock, and he's been fighting, you know, in the environmental justice movement and, you know, and in other struggles for, you know, over 50 something plus years. And so to me, whenever I start to feel like my, like, depression or like this is pointless, or like, I mean, you know, I'll be honest, you know, like the RBG thing and the you know, what's going to happen at the Supreme Court, and, you know, that's weighing heavily. And then, you know, having to remember that, you know, justice activists don't just roll over and just die because the powers that be want them to. That's not the way it works. You know, there isn't this kind of mass like depression, you know what I mean, that happens. And part of the meaning comes from the fight again. And I think this is a particularly important when it comes to climate change, because the scale and the scope of what we're facing is so terrifying. And I think that it might be different for young people because, but I think that's why, again, it's important to share the stories about why the fight is important. Because otherwise, you know, you can just go into kind of an individualized, like, well, what's the point? It's not going to happen, you know, that kind of thing. And part of what movements do is they create a culture, you know, and they create an affect. And that kind of cultural, emotional work is really, really important. And so that's where I think that, and this is maybe a good transition to Adelita, because her work is also in the cultural sphere. That's what social movements do. They also change the culture. And they change the common sense through art and storytelling and songs and the visual culture too. You know, the memes, the signs, the posters. And so I think the rap, the hip hop. I mean, some of the hip hop that came out of Standing Rock and the youth struggles, you know, is incredible. And it's not something that I understand, and you know, it doesn't speak to me, but it speaks to a lot of other people. And so I think it's good for us to understand that that is part of what movements are doing. If you get into like a depressive inevitability mode, then, you know, that's not, I don't see yeah, exactly. Pessimism is a luxury. I completely agree with you, you know? And so I think that's where now I'm distracting myself by reading the chat. So
I know, me too.
I find the chat so interesting. So I would rather turn it to Adelita, actually.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's turn it over to Adelita, and then we'll try to bring in some of the chat comments and questions later in a bit too. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, for like just the framing around your book, the information, the data, and how does someone like me use that, right? Well, this is an important moment, as Julie mentioned, and I'm going to start by just kind of talking about my own journey and how I got to the work I'm doing now. And that's, you know, it's a long journey, but I'm going to just try to summarize it for you guys. You know, how does what I'm doing have an impact? And that's important information for you as attendees. How can you also have an impact where you're at? And so basically, I think it's really important, our own personal stories, our own personal narratives, and how we tell our stories. As you know, as Pamela mentioned, you know, I have a background in digital film. I'm a storyteller, and I'm also a member of a frontline community. I was born in Coachella to farm working family with a long history of farm workers. My whole family was farm workers, and you know, I'm California born and raised. But we still we're all farm workers, and we traveled throughout California to follow the crops. My parents are Tejanos, and my grandparents are also Tejanos and Mexicanos, and so I have a mixture of an indigenous bloodline from both North and South of, you know, the Americas, and you know, we traveled throughout California and throughout the States to follow the crops, as I mentioned, but also as a farm worker, my dad was introduced to activism through the UFW through Cesar Chavez's movement. And so he was exposed to that and wanted to change the way he raised his kids, ourselves. He was like, no, we're not gonna, have you guys follow in our footsteps and work in the fields forever. We need to make a change. And we are humans. We deserve to be treated like humans. And he started to organize for Cesar, and my mom right alongside with him, supporting and organizing as well. But I was exposed to that as a young age, and did what I did with my kids is just, you're coming with me, we're doing this organizing. There was no babysitter. We were all our, a family unit, and that's what we did. We worked together. And so seeing that at a young age and knowing that we had the ability to organize for better living conditions was something that was inbred in me. So when we moved to Salinas, and there, just growing up all around agriculture, always, my sisters, they worked the grapes, they worked okra, I picked chile. I mean, we all had our turn working in the fields. And we did it to buy our school clothes and, things like that. But it was for us, just kind of no big deal, but because it was something we seen every day. It didn't feel like we were, that different. But, it was when we started, seeing that other kids didn't have to do that. We're like, okay, we, this is like a job. And so, but it's also, it felt like a valuable experience for us as we got older. And, then in high school, I, was exposed to lots of gang violence in Salinas, and anybody from Salinas knows that in the 90s, things were, it was a hotbed of gang violence there. And so I grew up in East Salinas, and we just seen so many of our friends getting killed. And at a young age, I was just like, this, why are we dying off? And so me and some friends, again, we're just peers. We're just young teenagers. We're like, let's do something. Let's say something about this. Let's not live in fear day to day. We shouldn't have to. And why isn't this being addressed by our schools, our police departments, our community? Everybody was just always reacting, oh my God, so-and-so got killed. And, it was getting worse and worse. And so we demanded, as youth at that young age, we were, let's find out how to share our message. We crafted a message. We started writing on paper and, doing poems, and we're like, let's act this out. And so again, my experience seeing what, Cesar was doing, we had seen El Teatro Campesino back then, performing in the fields for the farm workers, and also for the growers, exposing them for their wrongdoings. We decided to do the same. And so we started very, just very guerrilla style theater, nothing special. We made our own props. We paint, cardboard, cut out signs, really basic stuff. And we were performing. We were memorizing lines and just making things, just what they call rascuache style. And then we were, starting to get noticed, who are these kids? And we decided to give ourselves a name. We called ourselves first Los Illegals, and then we we were known as that for a while. And we just started building a reputation. And then, and so then we had the opportunity, one summer to be trained directly by Luis Valdez and his sons at El Teatro Campesino, which was a true blessing. And so we received formal training by, a mentor that, was a perfect fit for us, and were inspired, felt much more prepared, and developed even better scripts. And that is how we started to communicate with our community about the issues that were impacting us. And it was effective, and it was a way to capture the attention. And, kids started to look up to us. It was like, we were just not expecting all this type of response. We were just doing it because we didn't know how else to express our pain. We didn't know how express what we're going through. And it was a healthy way for us to deal with it, instead of turning to drugs, instead of turning to, the gangs. And that was a big problem back then. And, there's lots of opportunities. I see more opportunities for our youth now, but there was not a lot being offered for our youth back then. It was like, school to prison, or school to the fields, or, it was really difficult to see that. You kind of feel lost about, as a youth, not seeing anything better happening to your community. And so on that note, we knew we had something. I knew this was an effective way to get messages out. And I just, decided I wanted to do more of that. And we were then sponsored, we got grants. And from that developed a production company called Bachtin 12 Production, which is still very successful in Salinas. And, I'm, part of that family, and still, a founding member of that whole art. And so very proud of that. Also, I'm a danzante, and I have been a danzante for 25 plus years. And it is a tradition that, is passed down. And I learned at a young age, and was able to understand the value of ceremony, and honoring the earth, and honoring, the water, the seasons. And so this was part of my upbringing. And I still teach danza to this day. My palabra comes from Calpulli, Iskali. I is something that I am able to share with my children. But how that ties into my story is that it is how I carry myself. This is like my life. Every day I carry with me these stories. And because of that exposure, I have the empathy to know that the nature, Mother Earth, is our foundation, and it is our practice to honor these elements. And so for us, it has been prophesied that there was going to be this great change. And this is something that I've talked about, but never really thought that I'd see happen in my lifetime. And here we are. And so it's something that I'm having to prepare for, and say, like, look, we can be a part of the solution. It isn't the prophecy that we go away. The prophecy is that we are the change. For us, we are considered the people of the sun. And we are a powerful nation. And it's, up to all of us to be one nation, and to, rise up to the occasion. But, again, we are in a time where everyone is scared and confused and concerned, but we need to understand that we can turn that pain into power by, taking one another and telling our stories. And if you think that you can't make change, just today, and I'm not saying this is a big win, but the governor of California signed an executive order to phase out gas-powered cars by 2035. That is something that, I personally, as an activist, and alongside with all of my allies through Last Chance Alliance, have been putting pressure on the governor to make a change, to phase out fossil fuels. We've been putting pressure on him. And how we've been doing that is by telling our stories, raising up the frontline community concerns. And it's not enough for us. We see, that he is signing this. Part of it, we applaud that he's taken, executive action. But at the same time, we're looking at, the executive order, and we're like, wait, we're picking it apart. But at the, we're also, we're also very happy that, action is being taken at the state level. So by us telling our stories, by us sharing our experiences, as a frontline community member, sometimes you feel unempowered, you feel like part of the rat race, day to day, just trying to feed your family. But it is so important to remember that our stories are the ones that need to be lifted up. Our stories are the ones that everybody's story. But we're often the voices left out of the equation. And so we've been putting pressure on the governor to phase out fossil fuel production, and the harming that's taking place to frontline communities, to communities that live right next to oil extraction wells, is the reason why we are being exposed and dying from COVID. Because there's a disproportionate impact, and it's because we are the ones living by wells, we are the ones working in the fields, we are the ones toiling in different industries that are hurtful to our communities. So so important to lift up these stories, so important to feel empowered to do so. And the reason I'm sharing this now is because I know that there are folks that are listening that may wonder how they can make a difference, by telling your story, by, sometimes you take baby steps, and you do it at, in the mirror, or next step at, maybe at a protest, next time at a board meeting, at the school district or at the county level. They're all, and some people are not ready for that, but, I'm here to say, like, I'm willing to, like, meet you where you're at. And sometimes, folks are not ready to do the big, telling of your story, but it's just baby steps. And our stories are important and they matter. And it's how we're going to influence, policymakers, decision makers to consider the impacts that we're experiencing. And I know I'm rambling. So Pamela,
no, this is great. I'm so grateful. And I think what's really wonderful about this storytelling is that we can immediately start to see connections between people. I think it reminds us of so many of the things that we have in common. All three of us are mothers with teenagers, just starting there. How much does that change how you approach these issues? Because I know for me, it's been huge. There are a couple of questions that have started coming through the chat, and I think they weave in really nicely with some of what you've been talking about. I want to make sure that you and Julie get some chance to interchange as well, exchange ideas and thoughts. But one question that I think you were getting at this in your talk about art and culture and filmmaking, and Julie mentioned rap. I mean, all the ways that we can respond to this moment that are creative and life-giving. And we got a question from Scott about how to create the litany and ritual and celebration of our gift, this earth, in all things. So you two bring this profound awareness of the issues and of the moment that we're in. We're speaking right now in the context of being in a faith community. This is sponsored by several organizations, including the Church of St. Martin. And certainly we should know about litany and ritual and celebration. But we're a little behind, I think, on doing some of that around climate and around justice issues. So would both of you like to speak to how do we create that? Where do we go to find that and to be supported in that?
Yeah, honestly, we have always used petitions, with our group. I'm with Mothers Out Front. I'm also with Last Chance Alliance. I'm with, YOLO, the YOLO Climate Emergency Coalition, and different orgs. I sit on with, and I wear many different hats. But in order to, try to pressure our decision makers, we put together petitions and we share them out, and we amplify each other's efforts in different ways to make sure that we're gathering this, these numbers. Like they end up being like numbers. We're like, look at how many people, like this is the amount of pressure we begin to apply to our decision makers by amplifying, what we're doing and bringing along our neighbors, in the process. But it really does require, individuals, reaching out to your neighbors, to your friends, to your relatives, to share what you're doing. And they're going to be concerned. All you have to do is look around, especially when, the fires were taking place. But even before that, it's like, we're in a pandemic. Like, who is being affected? And so you reach out to your neighbors and you're like, look, this is what we're trying to do. Do you want to help? And usually they do, because they are being impacted, and they're concerned about the future, and they're concerned about what they're seeing happening. And that is typically what we do. We use different platforms. We make phone calls. Not everybody has access to the internet. Not everybody has access to, technology. So, traditional phone calls are actually very effective. Right now in the time of COVID, we're not supposed to be gathering, when we do, it's, of course, with safety, in mind,
Sure.
especially as moms. But that's how we're in new territory, and so we're really navigating all of these different factors and seeing what works. But very traditional communication is very effective, like phone calls.
Yeah. We had a question about some local issues, but I wanted to give Julie a chance. Did you want to say anything about, I loved your response that everyone has stories to tell. It doesn't matter sort of where you are in the system, but did you want to expand on that at all, or talk about rituals, litanies?
Well, I think you have a lot more to say, and I know that there are coalitions that are thinking about religious, faith-based initiatives for climate change, and I think it's really important. This is not my area of research, and actually not something I am deeply involved in, so I'm just speaking in a most general way. But I think the scary part for me is to watch how evangelical approaches to end times are shaping a lot of the political discourse. And there's a whole lot of people who are perfectly fine with climate change because it might confirm a worldview. Do you know what I mean? And so that's why I think that it's really important to take a faith-based perspective for justice that really foregrounds that. And that's not something that I can speak on or I can do, but I think it's absolutely important. And I know that there have been, there's a lot of organizing, and there's a lot of, climate scientists who are also Christians, but not, and also there was somebody who came to campus, I think she was also not just Christian and a climate scientist, but she might have also been evangelical. I can't remember. But, I think that it's absolutely central, the work that you're doing, to think about not ceding the ground on this to a particular slice of what religion and the environment look like. You asked me to speak about Benjamin Lay, and I talk about him briefly in the book, but I think you know more about him. But when I learned his story, it was a fascinating, because I think, for those of us who know any kind of history about abolitionism, we know that Quakers were, like pretty reliable abolitionists. But how did they get to that point? They had to get to that point because of people like Benjamin Lay. And so I think, I use him as an example of a sort of the justice like story. Like he was pushing a narrative, and he was, he helped change the common sense within the Quaker community and its position on slavery. Do you know what I mean? But it was, there's no natural reason why that should have happened. Do you know what I mean? And so you have to do that work in the communities that you're embedded in. And for Benjamin Lay, I think he was cast out of like 4 different Quaker congregations. And so he was definitely like he was giving inconvenient truths of his own time. And so that's why I think his story is so fascinating. And I think that, there's a lot of, examples of that, but you probably know them more than I do.
Yeah, that's great. If anyone has time to go look up Benjamin Lay, there's a book out called The Fearless Life of Benjamin Lay. I think that I will try to put in the chat. But he was an abolitionist before that was really a thing, and was so outrageous in some of his. I think this gets to the idea about sort of ritual and theater, and how important it can be to do some things sometimes that are shocking and attention grabbing in your context. He was trying to change the church that he was in, the Quakers, and I mean he would show up naked if he had to. He would disrupt meetings. He made a difference, and it's a pretty remarkable story. I think he's having a moment a little bit right now. We do have a lot of, Adelita, you're unmuted.
I wanted to mention, I seen a question, a mom who has a 16-year-old daughter who's watching. They started an environmental club, and I just want to say, she wants to know how they can get involved. Well, lots of ways. I think what we've been touching upon is, how do you develop and craft your own story, and how do you tell your own narrative? That's something that I think youth are really powerful at. As youth, you guys have a different experience than we did growing up. And Julie mentioned that as well. I think really telling your story, what you're going through, but also on that, like other action items. I just want to mention, we will be sharing like next steps, a call to action on how you can get involved or how can you have an impact. There's many different ways, and we're going to share them, sometime soon or towards the end, where there's different links, petitions, you can sign and have an impact like immediately, as these are petitions that are being circulated. But also here in Yolo County, as I mentioned, I'm part of the Yolo Climate Emergency Coalition. We're developing a climate emergency resolution for the county of Yolo, and that will hopefully get voted on the 29th. And all of you here can, sign a petition to support that. And so that our County Board of Supervisors can see that there is a lot of community members that know about this, that want to see this get pushed through. Juliet, who's on this call, is a part of that coalition. Many, I think, coalition members might be on this call tonight. And so Juliet just shared the link, how you can endorse the resolution. So if you want to click that, you can support local impact. Climate emergency resolution is something that if it gets passed for the county, we'll be helping to oversee implementation, and you can have a say in that. So there's lots of ways you can have an impact locally, at the state level, and of course at the national level, globally. There's so much to do. But I think local impact is so important because we are the ones living in this community, and we can tell our stories and tell our decision makers how we're being impacted and what change we want to see take place here, especially right now. It's such an important time. All you have to do is, look outside to see what's happening. The impacts are visible. So I just wanted to mention that to the mom who mentioned that. I'm a mom. I have 2 teenage boys, and they're the reason I'm doing the work that I'm doing. And so Pamela, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. No, there was you again. It's a good segue because there was a question about what the local Yolo County climate issues are, what primarily we're facing. I mean, I think we all know air quality. I mean, we've all been living with that. But if both of you could maybe maybe speak to that for just a moment, because like you said, we'll have some links at the end about things you can do, but there are people who just genuinely want to know what are the big issues facing Yolo County.
Well, oh, sorry, Adelita. The question, I mean, you already talked about the wildfires. You know, climate change is going to make wildfires, heat waves, hurricanes more intense, and so those will have very locally disproportionate impacts. And you know, many of you saw that there were people, agricultural workers and farm workers, you know, working through the AQI being at 300 or 400 and so on. So those disasters are going to come more frequently, more furiously, and as the pandemic showed, the impacts of these are not equal. I read a thing that said the part of the reason why there's so much disproportionality is that it's acute upon chronic. So that you already have this existing set of problems, and you throw this other thing on, and then it's just it's like boom, like lighting a torch. So wildfires and the air quality and heat waves, those two things really hit our community. Of course, we're vulnerable to, our region is very vulnerable to the levees, and flooding. And if there's any lesson from Hurricane Katrina, Sacramento has a big flood risk too. So all of those problems that, are major, and when major problems hit, they hit some people worse than others. So
yeah, and just again to mention, this is all taking place because of fossil fuel extraction. Our main goal with the climate resolution is to phase out fossil fuel and bring in green transportation. In the executive order that Governor Newsom signed today, his goal is to phase out fossil fuel gas-powered cars by 2035. To us, that's still a ways away. We want to see a shorter timeline on that. But fossil fuel extraction is California is one of the largest oil producing states, and we could do better. We want more from the governor. We want the governor to take stronger executive action by protecting our frontline communities. But this is why we are getting hotter summers. This is why our forests are drier because of the heat. And so, really continuing to put that pressure on the governor is important, to really advocate for a just transition, to advocate locally for bus fleets that are electrified, public transportation that is electrified. Access is important, because that's another thing, not everybody has the same income, but we should have access to those things as well. Just because folks aren't, maybe someone from a different income level can afford a green vehicle, electrified vehicle. I think those should be accessible to also lower income communities. We want to also live healthier as well. And just again, we're in an ag community, so water is a big deal. We were in a drought for a very long time, and we're not gonna, then we got a lot of rainfall, but that doesn't mean, there is not a drought season ahead of us. We will still see droughts. We will still see flooding. As Julie mentioned, our levees are so old. Our levees were built so long ago. And so they need to be considered when they're budgeting for, when our county's budgeting for those types of infrastructure. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to think about locally. And again, phase out that fossil fuel. That's what's really warming our planet. So that's what I have to say about that.
Fantastic. I understand we have someone on the call who is really another kind of expert in this area. Natalia Deep Sosa, are you here? I think you had some things in the chat. Nick, is it possible for Natalia to be unmuted?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi.
thank you. Could you jump in a little bit about the local issues that we face?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to share a little bit. I do a lot of work with local farm workers, so I just want to add that indeed, as both Julie and Adelita have shared, I collect their stories, and so part of my work is really understanding what has been their experience at this time with COVID, also with the smoke exposure, and so. Many of them do not have the luxury, as many of us have had, of working at home. And so during this time, farm work is the most hazardous job that exists. And we have to compound this with now COVID, with extreme heat, and with smoke exposure. So many of them do not own a car, so they have to take rides or share rides. Many of them, they have to take this job because they can't make ends meet otherwise. During this time, many of the employers did not provide PPE. Even though by law they have to provide an N95 mask, many of the employers did not provide them. These workers were, as many of you have seen in the news, they were there even in the heat, during the smoke, at all of these times. In addition, many of them, especially the seasonal farm workers, have terrible housing conditions. So that's an additional thing. They are exposed to pesticides. So also talking to what the mom and what the 16-year-olds, many of us here in this call, we have been collecting donations. We have been taking it to our local farm workers to be able to fulfill some of those needs that they have, that the employers and the county should be able to do. So how do we get this protected here to our local farm workers, because they are the ones who feed us every day. They are the ones who provide us with the fresh fruits and vegetables, even though they themselves cannot buy them because they don't have the money to be able to buy themselves the fresh fruit and vegetable because it's out of their reach. So I think that that's important. So I think that that's really key. Nick is asking what policy or regulation changes are needed. So part of the problem is that the policies and some regulations already exist, but they're not enforced. There's not the amount of people that can go and actually oversee or check what's happening. There's not enough people that can be hired and go and see it. We need to change the amount of power that the Farm Bureau has over our Yolo County supervisors and officials. That is unacceptable, the amount of power they have. So how do we change that? How do we make a priority, not the employer, but the employees? How do we make sure that our farm workers, their health, their safety are what is paramount for the county and not the farmers? Because the farmers, they have the responsibility, but they somehow are always never in the conversation. They're never the ones who are held accountable for providing the PPE, the test, or anything. It always falls back on the farm workers. So I think more policies would be great, but they're never enforced. So thank you for this opportunity.
I also want to mention, like, during the fires, there is even more pressure on the farm workers to work faster and harder because it's now an emergency situation, and the farmers don't want the food to be tainted. They don't want the food to have smoke flavor, or, you know, because it can infuse the fruits and vegetables. So the farm workers are encouraged to work faster and harder and longer so that the crops get picked and are not tainted. So it's another part of the problem that our farm worker community faces.
Yeah, and we're seeing younger and younger people now working in the fields now because a lot of the schools are going remote, and a lot of the English learners are not feeling that they're learning in school or are having a lot of difficulties, that we're seeing younger and younger children in the fields. And I think that we're failing a huge amount of young people and a generation. And so I think that our seasonal farm worker children, our English learners, we need to do better by them. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is really distressing. I mean, all of us eat, right? All of us are dependent on this work, and yet we just, for so many of us, it's sort of a consumer mentality, and we just don't think about the cost to human lives that's involved. I'm seeing some really good comments and messages about what we can do. I would love to see, I know that groups around Yolo County and elsewhere are doing this, but just pressure, I think for many of us, it's just adding to those voices saying this is not okay, and this is not just, and we don't want to be part of this anymore. Juliet's comment about just the terrible reality that people are facing. There was a question from Beth that I've somehow lost in the shuffle. Nick, maybe you could resend that if you saw that. I'm glad that several times the issues around young people have come up tonight. I think for many of us, as I said earlier, there's this connection of just being mothers, being parents, and the ways that has pushed us into being more active and being more aware. And I'm probably one of the older ones in this group of speakers, but we all have teenage kids, and I think we're at a generational shift moment too. We're seeing how much it is young people who are leading the way.
May I just say one thing about being mothers?
Please.
That pesticide exposure, all of this is a reproductive rights issue too, because a lot of our farm workers are women, and this has an impact on their reproductive capacities. And so we need to be aware, as many of you are mothers. I'm not a mother, but I am a person who is involved a lot in reproductive justice. This impacts the capacity of women to be mothers, and how also they can raise their own children, because pesticides get into their bodies, and then that impacts how their children are going to grow up, their learning capabilities, and all of this. So as you talk about the importance of being mothers, is also how do we allow other women to be the best mothers and to raise healthy children. And so I think that we need to be aware of that as well, because I think that we need to fight for everybody to be the healthiest person, to be the healthiest mom, but also to be able to raise the healthiest kids that they can. And when you're exposed to pesticides, to smoke, to heat, and your children do not live in a house that is adequate, that is not correct, and that limits your reproductive rights.
That's such an important point. And to me, the idea that my children are able, just like I'm able to work from home and remotely, and my children are able to connect well and go to school remotely, and it's not easy, but it's not that bad. And what some children are doing is ending up in this heat and the smoke in the fields instead. That's really, really heartbreaking. We had a question from one of our St. Martin's people. What place do folks in the environmental justice movement give to the need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuel as central to achieving climate justice? Does the environmental justice movement have specific plans on how this might be achieved? I mean, I know we've talked here about the Green New Deal and things like that. Julie, I see you unmuting yourself. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Adelita already talked about the need to stop fossil fuel dependency. And the environmental justice movement through the Climate Justice Alliance is a really good place to look at these principles of just transition. The just transition from fossil fuels originally came from the late 90s, when there was a lot of work that was being done to think about how to repair these conflicts between labor, organized labor, say in coal mines or whatever, and environmental movements. And so environmental justice was really at the forefront of thinking about just transition like 25 years ago, and now has really articulated these principles and practices very well. So I would just say, folks should look up the Climate Justice Alliance. They should look up the Jemez principles of organizing. They should look at just transition and see what it really means to think away from extraction and to kind of a regenerative model. And so these are, in some ways, fundamentally different starting points. They're different practices. They're different orientations. And so I think, and then how that looks is where the details come in. So I think there's a lot of really exciting work where people are trying to think about, okay, well, what do we think, not just in these abstract social movement ways, but like, how do we produce the change that we want to see?
Right. I also wanted to mention, there is a slide that you all are seeing now, and they have different calls to action that if you want to get involved locally, as I mentioned, we're trying to gather support for the climate emergency resolution that will be looked at on the 29th by the Yolo County Board of Supervisors. If you want to support that, there's two different links, one to support, show support, and then the other one, if you actually want to show up and testify in support of the resolution, you can do so on the 29th with that Yolo County Zoom link, and just chime in and say, hey, this is where I live in Yolo County. This is, an excellent, or, wherever you want to say to support the resolution in your own words is the best thing to do, is to share why you want to see it get passed. At the state level, again, there's a few links, pressure on the governor to, take bold action against the fossil fuel industry, against extraction in California. And we're going to be, collecting petition signatures via those links. And again, the pressure is working. He signed an executive order today. Why? Because we've been hitting him hard, and he's been talking climate, because we've been surrounded by smoke for over a month. Yes, the winds have passing, but there's still parts of California that have a blanket of smoke over them. And at the national level, vote. We're in an election time right now that is so important, and just register to vote. The young ones that are tuned in, if you have not read, if you're of age, register if it's your first time. It's just such an important time to vote. And also the organization I'm with, Mothers Out Front, we're having a national convening coming up in October. You're all welcome. And again, we offer trainings on personal narratives, and you're all invited to come to any of our trainings. But yes, the frontline communities look different in different parts of the United States and different parts of California. Here in the ag community, that there are a farm worker community. In the Central Valley, it's the communities that are working the oil rigs, that live right next to the oils, and they're, as Natalia said, they're all experiencing the same thing: reproductive health issues, pulmonary issues, and of course, different issues to access to clean air, to clean water, to clean, earth, to food. So they're across the board, that impacting our frontline communities' health. and the health of our children. And so it's so important that we do put that pressure on our decision makers ASAP.
Fantastic. Those are great next steps that people can take. I know we said we'd try to wrap up around 8:30. I had one final question I wanted to ask. Nick, should I share my slide first about what we've got for, are there several slides for people in our groups, our sponsoring groups, or is it just?
It looks like Juliet put information in the chat on how to participate with the Climate Strike Davis. And I think you can just look at that information and get involved there as well.
Yeah.
And it would be nice, Pamela, to end with a question around I forget how Julie put it, but the radical, non-naive.
Yeah, I wanted to close. Thank you. I wanted to close with that. I don't know if I can share a screen. Let me just try to show you some things that we're doing here. I think I can. Really locally here at St. Martin's. We are having a book group. We're gonna, maybe we'll have multiple book groups depending on how many people are interested, but we wanna get more people reading Julie's book and talking about it and using it as a transition point for taking more action. So that's one thing that you can do. We have a group that meets. Our Care for God's Creation group is the group that really got this event going. And this year we have a theme, which is, I think I got this right, healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy community. So we're sort of looking at that, from the ground up. And we are going to have a blessing of the animals. We do this every year. We're trying to figure out ways to do it safely in this new environment. So we'll have a sort of socially distanced one outside on October 3rd and one online during church on October 4th. So there's my email addresses on there, anyone who wants any information about those. We also are really learning kind of our own role in advocacy. The Episcopal Church has some great resources on a program called Voting Faithfully, and we'll be getting those out to our parishioners as well and getting them up on our website. A couple of things just to tie it up. I loved, Julie, in the beginning when you were talking about refusing our own innocence. I think it's a different framing than talking about privilege, which is also a really important concept, obviously, for many of us to keep grappling with. But you had a phrase, I don't know if it's original to you, forward dreaming, that's in your book, and where you find those sources of hope and the energy to keep moving forward. Hope and inspiration, especially when it feels like almost every day there's something new coming at us that kind of knocks the wind out of you for a bit. So I'd love to give you each about a minute to just share with us some of you, what forward dreaming means to you and some of your sources of hope and inspiration.
Well, I am continually renewed whenever I hear and learn from others. And so that's why, I do feel that the younger generation, without sort of saying it's all on them, do you know what I mean? But that's very gratifying and powerful, to hear the voices of young people who are fighting for this and not accepting, what many of us have just thought was the way it was. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm moved by that. And I'm moved by everybody has different songs that move them. But there's, like, for me, the soundtrack of Freedom is very like Motown 60s, 70s, So I talk a lot about Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye. And so for me, that music is obviously intimately tied to the civil rights movement. But I think, again, this idea of stories, we do have our own stories, but we can also connect to other stories that are not our own. And so for me, the dreaming and the storytelling and listening means that you have to keep on listening. You have to open up and not put your head down. And so that's how I continue to renew, and, you know, rereading the poetry of people like, you know, Audre Lorde and Langston Hughes and so on. So, you know, that's just some, you know, for me as an individual, but you know, it's a great question. And I think, you know, when we share these stories is when we feel something, and that the numbing is what we have to resist, because right now it's like boom, boom, boom of assaults, you know? And so I think we have to remember that feeling, the feelings, and that the search for freedom is about that ability to connect, not with only other people, but with the planet, and with to have kin with other creatures as well. And that's a moment where, you know, where that's really under fierce attack.
Yeah, I want to echo what Julie said. You know, it's something that right now we don't have a lot of, is that connection. But you know, we're stuck in this virtual space, and we have to make the most out of it. But man, I get inspired and recharged when I do show up to an action that we're all being, you know, safe and, you know, socially distanced, and it does recharge my battery, because we still care very deeply about the movement and also our children. And I'm inspired by the youth. I'm inspired by what you know, the youth is angry, they're passionate, they're concerned. And I am, you know, I'm so grateful that they're feeling the urgency to stand up and do something. And it gives me, you know, fire as well. It lights my fire, because, you know, we've been doing this, but when I see the young ones out there, I'm just like, man, you know, we're, you know, all generations, we need to be out there. And of course, with safety as a priority, that is the only way to gather. But also when it comes to music, and Julie inspired me to share some of my musical inspiration, you know, growing up, you know, Rage Against the Machine. That was my inspiration growing up in high school, and it is still very relevant. And it is the machine that we have to rage against right now. So yeah, it's just, I'm at peace.
You two are just beautiful and amazing. And you have certainly given me a huge dose of hope and inspiration tonight that I really needed. There are so many people to thank for making tonight possible. And I don't even want to try, because I'm gonna miss somebody. But this, like we said, this is being recorded. We're going to get it out there on YouTube and some other places. And I really hope that it is the beginning of a conversation. It is. I loved what Julie said about listening, and we need to listen to each other, and we need to be there and support each other. And Adelita, I want to hear more about this monster we may be facing. So I might be calling you to ask for some more insight, and about Mothers Out Front as well. Nick or Juliet, you were major organizers. Do you have anything you want to say before we close it up for the night? Oh, you're both muted. Oh, there we go, Juliet.
I'm just thrilled that we are coming together as a community. I've been a lifelong social justice organizer, and, you know, here in Davis for 12 years, and really feel like the environmental justice issues need to be front and center in our organizing. And so in some ways, this is helping us pivot and bring into focus what I think should be the priorities for our climate organizing. We have an incredible amount of resources in communities like Davis, and how we can work together to build the bridges, to look at who is the most marginalized. We've been doing this during COVID, right? Like thinking about the elderly and those who are most exposed. Now we need to do this for the environment, for the overall
environment that we live in, that we breathe in, and recognize that other people are disproportionately impacted. And the children are getting this too. It's like really important that they're engaged in concrete acts of solidarity, because everything has become so insular. I just feel like this discussion is going to spread and bring in into focus our movement energy in a much more cohesive way, to be recognizing the frontline struggles of people in our region and around the world. And so I really thank you for your contribution tonight. And I look forward to seeing us back with social distancing in the streets, in the park. We've been striking every Friday for the last year at the corner of 5th and B, with some concrete demands around change and emergency action. And we'll be there this Friday, and it will be very creative and energized. We were making art today, and I can't wait to see us gathered safely to speak out more about these issues. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that work. And thank you again for everybody who helped bring this together. It's just, it really, really gives me that strength that I need. And I hope it has done that for everyone who has gathered here tonight. And I hope that everyone is involved in some way. If you're in Yolo County on the 29th, get that going. Let's use our voices. Let's use our power together. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So grateful for the connections and for everyone.
Good night, everyone. Rest well. We've got work to do.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Adelita. And
good evening.
Thank you, Pamela. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.